know that, you know.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, again, we're coming into your presence to open your word and to see what you have for us. I pray, Lord, tonight that you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those things that you'd have to be said, and anoint our hearts to receive. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. We're here.
All right, hey, we got the crew coming in now. I have to apologize for this mess, but I'll have a word with the pastor about this nonsense. And, you should have seen it when we got there. So anyway,
I recognize those chairs. I know where they came from.
they're out of the sanctuary. They're getting ready for the Valentine's banquet. But they got to do a better job than just throwing them in there.
Those blue chairs came from our church. Our church.
Yeah, they were originally from there.
Yeah. In fact,
We're still working on getting them cleaned up, and we'll get them all done. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we're going to cover the 17th and 18th chapters of 2 Samuel. There's a lot of material in here, so I'm going to try to move fast, as fast as I can through it, so we're not here for 2 hours or 2.5 hours. Just to clear up, sometimes when I have my on-ground classes, I lecture for 4 solid hours, so I can talk forever, it doesn't bother me.
It's all right, I'm used to it.
Well, I got a captive audience, they have to be there.
It's my break time here too.
All right, so let's go ahead and start with chapter 17, beginning with verse 1. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Now let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and weak, and make him afraid. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. Then I will bring back all the people to you. When all return, except the man whom you seek, all the people will be at peace." And the saying pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. So here was Ahithophel's idea, or his plan. He, notice the word he would lead 12,000 men. In other words, appoint me commander-in-chief. I'm going to be now the new general in charge of the army. That was his plan. And I will take 12,000 men, and we're going to take off right now. We're not going to wait. We're not going to add up provision. We're just going to take right off, and we're going to catch David unawares. And when we catch him, all the people will flee, and we'll just kill David and bring all the people back. It sounded like a pretty good plan. And the elders, remember we talked about the elders, they're the ones that had the real power, who had the armies, and so the elders had brought their armies to Jerusalem to be under Absalom, and so he was able to say, we'll just take 12,000. So there was probably a whole bunch more out there. Now remember, at this point, David only had 600 men. So you take the odds, 12,000 to 600, pretty good odds. Yeah, might work pretty well, Especially if you can get him before he's in hiding. And so that was his plan. Now, it's interesting that the name Ahithophel means brother of foolishness. Brother of foolishness. And so this really kind of summarizes this man. Now you remember he was considered one of the wisest men in the ancient Israeli history. He's right up there with not Absalom, but Balaam, who was another one who was considered one of the wisest. We don't know that, we don't see that from Scripture, but when you look at the literature and the history, that's what they thought about these two men. And in fact, Ahithophel, he was actually considered, or they called him, an angel because of his good counsel and his wisdom. Mm-hmm. And so, but his name meant brother of foolishness. And sometimes the names mean more You get more from the names than you do from the actual character when it comes to the Bible. Now they assumed that David would be too tired to fight, that he would, so that Ahithophel would target David, and then he would bring the whole rest of the family back to Jerusalem. Remember that David was the father of Absalom, and so the whole family went with David. So basically, here you have Absalom in Jerusalem, and the whole family's gone. The only thing that's left are the 10 concubines that were left to take care of the palace. And so here's Absalom without a family. And so what Ahithophel is saying here, I'll bring your family back to you. And I'll bring back the 600 mighty men. Any of them that are left, we'll bring them back. And, you know, you can hire them to be your bodyguards. I mean, these are the unsaid things that he's trying to get across here. And then finally, with David gone, the kingdom would be at peace. There wouldn't be anybody to rise up against Absalom. Now, we don't know how many tribes joined Absalom. But we do know that those that did join him, the leaders were in Jerusalem. Now, we know they didn't all 12 join him. We'll find that out a little later, that some of them did not. All right, let's move on, verse 5. Then Absalom said, now call Hushi the Archite also, and let us hear what he says too. And when Hushi came to Absalom, Absalom spoke to him, saying, Ahithophel has spoken in this manner. Shall we do as he says? If not, speak up. So Hushi said to Absalom, the advice that Ahithophel has given is not good at this time. For, said Hushi, you know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and that they are enraged in their minds, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is a man of war, and will not camp without the people. Surely by now, he will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in some pit, or in some other place. And it will be, when some of them are overthrown, at the first, that whoever hears it will say, there is a among the people who follow Absalom. And even if he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will not melt completely. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. Therefore I advise that all Israel be fully gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, like the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So we will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him there shall not be left so much as one. Moreover, if he has withdrawn into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will put it into the river until there is not one small stone found there. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushi the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel. So the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. Now, we don't know for sure why. Yes?
Who is Hushi?
That was, remember, Hushi was David's private servant. He was called his friend. He was the one that served David. And probably through even possibly the time when Saul was chasing him. And so Hushi had the best idea or understanding of David and how he thought and what he would do. And that's probably why Absalom called for his advice. I don't think he trusted Hushi. I don't think he said, oh, Hushi's surely going to forget about David and be my friend. But he also understood this was the guy who probably could give him the best idea and advice about David. All right, so Hushai advised Absalom. He said, first of all, the advice of Ahithophel is not good for this time. What that phrase meant was, he has given really good advice. He's always been a good advisor. But this time, he's wrong. This is a time when he has missed it. His advice is not good advice. And he backs this up by giving a very accurate account of the ferocity of David and the mighty men who are with him. And of course, we only see here, this is not a direct quote of everything that was said. So I would assume that Hushai probably elaborated by, giving some examples. When David was over here, and when he was over here and his raiders came in, they wiped him out, and when they were over here. So he was probably backing up what he was saying with some examples. But what he said basically is their fierceness. We know how fierce they are. We know what kind of fighters they are. But that fierceness is going to be amplified. It's going to be greater, since now they're going to be enraged at the loss of their home, at the loss of their farms, their cattle, and having to bring their families out with them. That's going to make them a little upset. And so these guys that are normally mighty fighters and valiant men, they're going to be harder to deal with, because now they have a cause. When they were following David and they joined themselves to David. But it really wasn't their fight. These were all Philistines, or, these 66 valiant men. They had no stake in what happened. And David backed that up last week when he left the city and said, you guys go back. Don't go with us, because you don't have any stake in this. Right? It's not your fight. But it didn't matter. But now, it suddenly is their fight. It's their family. Their homes that are being taken away. Now they have an interest, and that's going to make them fight all the harder. And then David, he knew all about war. So David was not going to sleep with the people. You're going to fall on the people, but David's not going to be there. He's going to be off by himself with his bodyguards. He's not going to stay around the people. And you think you're going to get him. You're going to attack, and he's not going to be there. What are you going to do? Stand with your hands in your pocket and say, well, now what do we do? And about the time you're standing there, he's going to come out of the ambush. He's going to wipe you out. So that's what he's talking about here. Now, this is important, I think, also to understand that Absalom was not a fighter. And Hushai, Hushai's words would bring fear to him. It would cause him to be fearful. If he went out into battle, Hushai says, he's probably already hiding. He's probably already in a cave. He's probably already put himself in some kind of a defensive stance. And because he's a man of war, he's going to do that. And you're going to come out there, and this is what's going to happen to you. So Hushai is a very, very intelligent man. He's not only countering the advice of Ahithophel, which he knew was good advice, but he's doing it in such a way that he's not damaging Ahithophel, really. He's just saying, this time the words aren't true and aren't good, and here's why: because I know the man better than he knows the man, and this is what's going to happen. And then he amplifies that. These were all very true statements, but the way he words it, the way he talks about it, it just brings fear into the heart of Absalom. All right. Now the advice of Ahithophel, by the way, was based on the fact of his 12,000 men versus 600 men. The advice of Hushai was that David only has 600 men. And so you bring this army, and 12,000 isn't going to be enough. You've got to wait a while. And there was a reason why he wanted them to wait a while. And that was to give David a chance to put his armies together. And Hushai knew where he was going, and he knew that where he was and where he was going to be advantageous to David if he could get there. He mentions this, which is interesting. Where is it here? He says this. He says, number one, you put all of your armies together. You get all the armies, not a few. You get all the army. You get as big an army as you can, number one. And then, and get it from Dan to Beersheba, by the way. On the back there is a map. You can see where Dan is along the Mediterranean coast in just a little ways. And down to Beersheba. You don't see Beersheba, but it's the last large city before you go into the Negev Desert. In fact, it's the largest city of the Negev Desert. So if you kind of look at that, I think it's the second map that's in there. Maybe it's the first map. So I better look now.
I don't see Beersheba.
Oh, second map. You see Dan? You see it?
Yeah, but I don't.
Right over against the
There it
coast. You see Ephraim, Benjamin, and Dan.
And then there's Beersheba.
All right, Dan is what we're talking about there. So he said, you get all of the armies between Dan and Beersheba. Well, you see, Dan is below Ephraim, is below Manasseh, Zebulun, Eshkar, Naphtali, and Asher on the west side of the Jordan. Those were all evidently tribes that were not aligned with Absalom. Okay? So the only ones he had really were Dan, Benjamin, perhaps, Judah, Simeon. Maybe 4 tribes. But they would still raise a very large army. All right. Now he says some interesting things here. He says when we find him, what we're going to do is we're going to attack. And not with 12,000, but if we have 100,000 men, which is what he's looking at here, probably from these tribes, knowing the amount, the size of the armies they put together in those days. If we come on here with 100,000 men, it's going to be like the dew from heaven falling on them. You're not going to be able to get away from it. It's just going to keep coming and coming and coming until we defeat them. So we're just going to defeat them with numbers, but 12,000 isn't going to be enough. We need more. So he was kind of agreeing with Ahithophel's idea there of coming at him with numbers. And notice he says this, and of him and all the men who are with him, there shall not be left so much as one. Ahithophel's idea was to keep the soldiers, the mighty men. Hushai's idea is let's kill them all. So he was again appealing to the ego and the whole persona of Absalom. Yeah, we defeat the mighty men as well as David. Look at where that puts me. I am now the king, and I have a lot of might behind me. I've killed off what is considered the mightiest men in the nation, you see. So that's what Hushai is appealing to. And then he makes an interesting kind of thing here. You kind of laugh at it. He says if he goes into a city, we have such a large army, we'll just bring in ropes and wrap it around the city, and every man will get a hold of those ropes, and we'll just pull the whole city right down into the river. Well, that seems preposterous, but really what he was saying is something they did do at times. If they could get a rope around a tower or something on the wall, and they had enough men, they would actually pull the wall down. The problem was getting a rope that wouldn't break. I mean, that would be your problem there. You know, they didn't have cable like we have. I mean, you can get some of that big cable off the bridge out here, you might be able to do that. But that was his idea. And so Absalom and all of the leaders with him, they all decided that was the best plan. And so they would follow that plan. All right, so after Hushai gives this advice, in verse 15, Then Hushi said to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, thus and so Ahithophel advised Absalom and the elders of Israel, and thus and so I have advised. Now therefore send quickly and tell David, saying, do not spend this night in the plains of the wilderness, but speedily cross over, lest the king and all the people who are with him be swallowed up. So, as we learned last week, the idea was that Zadok and Abiathar would be spies for David. They were, remember, the priests. And so whatever any of the spies and David's followers in the city learned of anything, they brought it to Zadok and Abiathar. And you remember they had two sons. And the two sons were the runners, or the messengers. And so they would tell one of the two sons, or both of them, and they would run to where David was and give him the message. And that was the plan. And so Hushi, of course, knew this, so he came to Zadok and told him everything that he had said. What the plans of Ahithophel were, and what his advice was. And notice his advice. He says, now, you tell David to run quickly. Now, wait a minute. We just learned that the advice of Hushi was better advice, and so Absalom was going to wait until he had his whole army together, and all of that. So why is Hushi concerned that David keep moving?
He's playing him.
Huh?
He's playing him.
Playing?
Yeah, he's playing them one against the other.
No.
Okay.
Well, look, because he tells him to go tell David, and up here he's siding with Absalom and them.
Okay, yeah. But the real reason behind this is because he knew Absalom. And he knew also Ahithophel. So he figured as soon as he left, Ahithophel was going to come in and sit down with Absalom and begin to say, look, this is not a good plan. My plan is better. So if he came in with a counter argument without Hushi there and convinced Absalom, because we already know Absalom had no idea what he was doing. What was the first thing he did when he came in the city? He asked Ahithophel, what do I do now? I'm here, what do I do now? He didn't have that skill and ability of leadership to be able to make decisions. And so it would be very easy if Ahithophel decided to probably convince Absalom that, well, maybe we'll use both plans. Let's take some men out now and go after David, and if it doesn't work, put your army together. And so you can see where he could have convinced Absalom. So Hushi's advice was, and it was very good advice, don't depend on Absalom following my advice. And so get moving. Get over Jordan. It was important that they cross Jordan. Now, we've been to Jordan. I mean, isn't that a big fortress? I mean, isn't that a big river that's going to stop anybody? Some places you can step over almost, I mean, it's not that huge a river. Easy to cross in places. So, why was it so important that he crossed the River Jordan? It was because on the other side of the River Jordan were the tribes that were better aligned with David. These were the tribes that were always left out of everything because they were on the other side of Jordan. So they had a natural history of whenever the tribes that were on the west side of the Jordan wanted to do something, the ones on the east side didn't really want to join. Because they couldn't get support from them for anything else, only when they needed their armies. And they were very, very friendly to David. And so Hushi knew if you cross that river, once you got over that river into that other territory over there, which is called Gilead, that these were fierce mountain fighters. And if they supported David, it was going to be very, very difficult for any army coming over that Jordan River to defeat them. So that was his advice. All right, so let's go down to verse 17. Now Jonathan and Ahimaaz stayed at El Rogel, for they dared not be seen coming into the city. So a female servant would come and tell them, and they would go and tell King David. Nevertheless, a lad saw them and told Absalom. But both of them went quickly away and came to a man's house in Bahurim, who had a well in his court, and they went down into it. Then the woman took and spread a covering over the well's mouth, and spread ground grain on it, and the thing was not known. And when Absalom's servants came to the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" So the woman said to them, "They have gone over the water brook." And when they had searched and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. All right. So these two runners, these two spies, had evidently already made several trips to David. And we'll know about that, why I say that here in a few minutes. But they got the word from Zadok, or Abiathar, and so they were setting off when they got spotted by a boy, a lad. And the lad immediately went to Absalom and said, "Hey, those two guys you've been looking for, you know, the sons of they're out there, and they're over there at the well, just outside of Jerusalem." Now, they were evidently known to be spies, or were at least suspected of that. And so the two guys, now incidentally, in your paper there's a picture there of a well. It's called Joab's Well. See that there? That was taken in 1910, by the way, so it's fairly ancient. But that is what is considered the well that these two men went to, because it's the only spring that's in the vicinity where Jerusalem was. So this would be the logical hiding place. So you can see it was not just a hole in the ground or whatever. They actually had buildings, and there was stuff there where they could hide. And that's where they probably took up residence and stayed out of sight. But when they realized that the boy had spotted them and was going to tell probably Absalom, they took off and they went to this other city. And this city was the same one that David had passed through a couple of just a day or two maybe earlier, and that's Bahurim. May have even been the day before when he passed through. And you remember Shimei was the guy who went on the edge of the mountain cussing and swearing and throwing rocks at David. You remember the story? We talked about it last week. Well, here's the same town. And so the two men came into town, and they found a man who had a court. In the court he had a well. Wealthy men had their own wells or cisterns that they would have put in their property to gather water. And if it had a well, of course, then they would have their own water supply. And the two men went down in the well. Now, you know, we think about a well here, we're thinking about that little circle, you know, with the bricks up and the little house and the little bucket with the thing that you turn and let the well. That's not the way these wells were. You know, we visited a couple of wells, and actually they were tunnels that went down kind of in the ground at an angle. And as the water level would rise or fall, you could go down this trail, or this winding trail down into the water, this tunnel, and you could get your water. And if the water went down further, you took a few more steps to the water. And if the water was high, you didn't have to go as far down that trail. And that's the way they were built. And so they went down into this well. Now they had a small opening over the well. And evidently it was perpendicular, but not necessarily. And so what the woman did, she was probably a servant, after they had went into the well, she took a covering, and probably from the word that's used here, it would be like a curtain that they put over the front of their doors, you know, and they used them for various things. We call it an awning maybe in these days. And she laid that over the well, and then she went and got some grain that they had already threshed, and all of the stuff was out of it, and she laid that all over this covering. You say, why would they do that? Because they dried their grain. This means it was probably summer, hot. And they would put the grain out, and it was a way of dehydrating their grain. Today we throw them in a dehydrator, you know, put them in a little bag and they last forever. Well, that's what they would do with the grain. And they would take a certain amount of it and they would dry this grain out. And that's where raisins come from, by the way. It's the same process, only they leave it out in the ground in the hot sun, the grapes, and they turn into raisins. And so that's what was going on here. And so when the men from the city came into Baharaim, they were probably directed to this man's house, because there were certainly those in the city that didn't like David. We found that last week. Maybe Shimei, who knows? They're over there at Bob's house. If you go over there, we saw them over there. And so they went over the two guys to find these two young spies. And of course, when they asked the lady, I like her answer, they crossed over the brook. She didn't say what brook. Some say she meant the Jordan River. Well, they weren't very close to the Jordan River. How would she know if they crossed the Jordan River? That was a few miles away. But it could have been a brook right there close. It could have been the brook Kidron. Who knows? But by not identifying it just a brook is a bunch of water. If this was a well and had a stream of water running through it, does that qualify for a brook? You know? Yeah. So, I mean, you can look at it and say, well, did she lie, or was she telling kind of a half-truth? You know, I mean, you could take it and say, yeah, they were over the brook, they'd gone down in the well. You know, but that's just a side thing, but it's something you can kind of think about. It'll keep you awake tonight wondering about that one, maybe. Anyway, they couldn't find him, and they went back to Jerusalem. Now, verse 21. Now it came to pass after they had departed, that they come up out of the well and went and told King David and said to David, arise and cross over the water quickly, for thus has Ahithophel advised against you. So David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed over the Jordan by morning. Light, not one of them was left who had gone over the Jordan. Now the message from these two young spies is interesting. He never mentions Hushi's advice. You notice that? Mm-hmm. Just Ahithophel's. Why? Now, it doesn't say, but my personal thing is, I think that they were instructed not to give him Hushi's advice so that they would not become complacent in thinking that they had days or weeks or months to get prepared. This said, you're in imminent danger, you've got to go now. And you know, this is something that I think is applicable to us today. You know, we have this thing of saying, we're going to be here for a long time. You know, Jesus hasn't come in 2,000 years. What's the chance he's going to come in my lifetime? So I have all kinds of time to get ready. Now, we may not say that, but it's certainly evident when you watch how people serve God. Well, I've got time. Well, you know, I can do that later. I can learn that later. I can witness later. Now, at my age, I've had a lot of laters. 70 years of serving God, and I've had a lot of laters. And I'll tell you, you run out of laters. I look back and I say, why didn't I do that then? Why didn't I spend more time in the Word then? You know, when I had enough energy to really get up and do something, I wasted it on other things. Later. But I'll tell you, He is coming and He wants us active, moving, working, not sitting, moving now. Because the time is at hand, like it has never been before. People say, well, I've heard that. I've heard that all my life. Well, okay, fine. You're one day closer than you were yesterday.
Yeah. Really?
You know? It's coming. It's going to happen. Destruction is going to happen on this world. A lot of things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And Christians have come into this place of lethargy.
I know that.
Well, it'll happen later. We need to take the advice of Hushi. Yeah, we know what's going to happen. Yes, we know who's going to win. And yes, we know all of this. So, we can just sit back. No. You don't really, act like you don't know the end of the book. You ever think about that? Act like you don't know the end of the book. How would you act differently? All right, move on. I'll be here all night.
I don't know what to do anymore. Something.
All right. Notice this, that by morning, everyone who was with him had crossed the Jordan. Now, you got to expand your mind a little bit here. You know, we're thinking about David, 600 men, and a few people. It was 600 men, all of their families, all of their kids, all of their servants, plus David, all of his family, all of his servants, supplies, whatever cattle they could drive out, sheep, whatever. We're talking about 1,000, maybe 2,000 people that are going to have to cross the Jordan in one night. Now, the places to cross, I'm sure, were not, you know, they didn't have ferries and bridges and stuff like that. You had to ford your way across that river. And I'm sure they were at a spot where it was easy to cross, you know, but still, you're not going to bring all these people across. And you don't have Moses standing there or Joshua. You know, roll back, walk across on dry land, no problem. They didn't have that. And so to move across the Jordan meant they were under immense pressure to keep moving. Get across that river and get where it's safe. All right. Verse 17. Now when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he saddled a donkey and arose and went home to his house, to his city. Then he put his household in order and hanged himself and died, and he was buried in his father's tomb. You say, what in the world was this guy doing? He's supposed to be wise. Well, he went home to Gilo, which was where he was at. You remember when Absalom called him to come and be his counsel, his advisor. He was in Gilo offering sacrifices. That was his hometown. And he went back there and he realized that not only was his pride wounded because Absalom didn't take his advice, you know, that's our initial response, well, his pride was wounded and he just couldn't live with it. But any chance he had of ascending to the throne were now gone. Absalom had no children, so he had no successors to the throne. Ahithophel was his closest advisor, and he wanted, of course, to be now the general of the army. And so it would stand to reason that he was anticipating being the heir apparent to the throne. He realized now there was no chance of that. His counsel had been considered as not timely or not correct. But the most plausible reason is because he was a wise man. That he knew that by waiting, Absalom and his army was going to be defeated. You remember God said that it was his plan to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. His counsel was good. It would have succeeded if God had not moved on Absalom to call in the friend of David, probably the most unlikely man to seek counsel from, except for his knowledge of David, to give him counsel and then accept that counsel. And Ahithophel said, he knew that Absalom was going to be defeated. And he also knew that since he was a traitor to David, where did that put him? When David came back into the city, he knew what was going to happen to him. One of those mighty men were going to come knocking on his door one day, and he was going to separate his head from his shoulders in one mighty swing. Yeah. And so he went home, wrote out his will, took care of all of his businesses, and hung himself. He figured that was the best way out. All right, verse 24. Then David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed over the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. And Absalom made Amasa captain of the army instead of Joab. This Amasa was the son of a man whose name was Jethro, an Israelite who had gone into Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. So Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. You say, what has this got to do with anything? You know, I mean, why do they throw this stuff in here right in the middle of things? This was somebody's mother and she went in and did this or that. Well, there's a very good reason for all of this. Number one, David went to the city, Mahanaim, which was on the other side of Jordan, near the river Jabbok. Now this is the place where Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending the ladders. It was at this same place. It was also the place where, after wrestling with the angel, Jacob came back to this place and divided his family into two groups in preparation for meeting Esau. If you remember, he sent one group and then he waited and sent the other group, and after everybody had crossed over, then he came along. So hopefully they would take all the wrath of Esau, and by the time he got there, you know, everything would be cool. my take, yeah. That's my thing. Anyway, it was also the city that Abner chose for Ishbosheth's government. You'll remember that Ishbosheth decided to set up a kingdom, and he was going to be king of Israel, and so he went there under Abner's direction, because Ishbosheth didn't have the skill or the intelligence to lead anything, we find just by the narrative of the story and from Josephus and others. And so he went to Mahanaim, and it was under Abner, who really wanted to set him up as king. And again, very similar to Ahithophel, he figured he could take over from Shibbosheth at some point. Anyway, that's where he did it, and that's where he was defeated. So the people of that city were already sort of rebels, and you know, again, like I said earlier, anything that the government in Israel did, they were against. And so they went into that city. All right. Now this was also one of the chief cities of the land of Gilead. Now, from the length of time it took for Absalom to gather his army. Now, you have to remember, the army, when they did this, was not provisioned. In other words, it wasn't like our military. You know, we can take and bring our military and kind of send them wherever we want, because all of the gear, all the food is already prepared. You know, it's all ready to go. I mean, they're cooked, ready to go. I mean, if it's not already cooked and packaged for the rations, they used to call them. Now they have them in those nice packs, you know, that has spaghetti and meatballs and all kinds of stuff in them, and they're not bad. Those are all ready to go. So if we have to send somebody or send a large army someplace, we can do it in a matter of days, especially with transportation the way it is. In those days, they had to bring the armies together. Then they had to train a little bit together, because each army was under a different commander and did ways things differently. So they had to make sure everybody was going to be coordinated. They had to appoint who was going to be the leader and how they were going to divide up. All that had to be done. Then they had to go out and gather all the food. They didn't have cold storage like we have today. So they had to go out and get all the fresh food and have all that ready to go. Animals to bring so they could slaughter them to feed the troops. You know, they had to have all of that ready. And then you had to have all the support. wherever you had to have blacksmiths, and you had to have all of that with you in order to keep the weapon sharp and all. So you begin to see that we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of people that had to be gathered together to support the army. You didn't do that overnight. Typically, it took months to get these armies together. And we've already looked at that. When David had to put an army, or Saul had to put an army together, how long it took to get all this done. So in the meantime, David is in Mahanaim, and he's putting together an army. Now, it wouldn't be an army like Absalom had. We would call them today National Guardsmen, really. It's kind of what they were. These were guys who came to the defense of Israel when they were called, otherwise they were farmers or whatever. Now, they were probably good fighters, but they were not considered your skilled, valiant men. And David was putting together his army in Mahanaim. So, in the length of time it took for Absalom to get his army together, David also got his army together. Now, Absalom appointed Amasa captain of the army. Now, he was an Israelite and a nephew of David. That's why we have all of that genealogy. If we follow it all through, he was a nephew of David, just as Joab was a nephew of David. So Joab and Amasa were cousins. Now, so what Absalom was doing was putting a captain over his armies that was considered equal with Joab as far as genealogy and who they were. Okay? So Absalom came with his army, and they camped in the land of Gilead. And that means it wasn't too far from where David was. Now it happened. Now we're going to go back here a little bit. Now we're going to learn what happened when David came to Mahanaim. What happened when David had come to Mahanaim, that Shobi, the son of Nahash, from Raban of the people of Ammon, Makar, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar, and Brasilia, the Gileadite, from Rogelim, brought beds and basins, earthen vessels, and wheat and barley and flour, parched grains and beans, lentils and parched seeds, honey and curd, sheep and cheese of the herd for David and the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Okay. So what happened when he got there? All the people came, and they had a big feast, and they brought all of this food for David and his men. What is interesting is this. I want to read this to you. Shobi must have been a brother of Hanan, disapproving probably of that young man's outrage upon the Israelite ambassadors. He had been made governor of Ammon by David on the conquest of that country. Remember back, Saul sent adversaries, and they killed them, and they took their heads off, and they did all kinds of things to them. You didn't do that to emissaries. You don't do it today, you didn't do it then. So, when David came to power, he just rolled in there and wiped them out. Well, after he had done that, then he appointed Shobi to be the governor. So he was an appointed governor by David. Makar, supposed by some to have been a brother of Bathsheba. Now we start to see why all this is fitting together. And then there was Brasilia, a wealthy old grandee, whose great age and infirmities made his loyal devotion to the distressed monarch particularly affecting. The supplies they brought, which besides beds for the weary, consisted of the staple products of the rich lands and pastures, may be classified as follows: edibles, wheat, barley, flour, beans, lentils, sheep and cheese; drinkables, honey and butter, or cream, which may be mixed together, form a thin diluted beverage, light, cool, and refreshing, being considered a luxurious refreshment. The supply of it shows the high respect that was paid to David and his loyal and faithful subjects at Mahanaim. All right. Now, this also shows that the elders were aware of the situation and knew that war was inevitable. The stuff they brought would be things that you could take into war for soldiers. That would be nourishing, strong. We'd say today, they were looking at the value of the food. It was high value. All right. All right, so now we jump into chapter 18. A lot of verses in 18, but hopefully we'll cover them quicker. All right. All right, chapter 18, verse 1. And David numbered the people who were with him, and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishi, the son of Zuriah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Iti, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. But the people answered, you shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us. Nor if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now. For you are now more help to us in the city. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Wow. Now, there were 2.5 tribes on the eastern side of Jordan. They were probably joined by some of the tribes on the western side. I mentioned Manasseh possibly. Also possibly Ephraim. You remember Ephraim were a bunch of... They liked to go into fights. If they weren't behind Absalom, they very well may have been behind David. There were also, I'm sure, people or soldiers from Judah, David's own tribe, who came over, AWOL, from their tribe and came over to join David. May have also been Benjamites, since Benjamites are not mentioned as being part of Absalom's army, and anytime they were in an army, they usually heard about it, So, we can suppose some of these were there. But notice the numbers, thousands. They'd gone from 600 to thousands. So now they were a formidable match, because they had the 3 greatest generals of their era to lead them. They had men, not just National Guardsmen. These were the soldiers who were everyday soldiers for these tribes, because they didn't have the Confederacy and the other tribes on the west side behind them. They had to be well-skilled in fighters. And the ones especially from Gilead were considered mountain men, really, really tough guys. All under the leadership of these 3 great men. Now they knew the object of Absalom was to kill David. And notice their statement, if they defeat us and we run, they're not going to chase us. If they kill half of us, they're not going to go after the other half. They don't care about us. We have no value here. But you do. You do. And so you stay here. You're going to be of more value to us here than on the battlefield. What did that statement mean? It meant that they trusted their generals to bring victory. And by staying in the city, he kept himself from being killed. They would have to defeat the armies before they could get to David. If he's in the battlefield, there was always a chance they could get him. All right, let's read on. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishi, and Iti, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains' orders. So as they were passing out the gate, he stopped these 3, and everybody listening, he said, I want you to deal gently with Absalom. Now I've heard preachers get up and say, well, that was because it was his son. I've heard them compare that to, with the father and the son. And, he wanted to deal gently, but he couldn't. He had to have Jesus killed. And I've heard all kinds of things. But when you really analyze this, was David really that interested in Absalom as being his son? Absalom had already turned on him once before. Absalom had already done things he shouldn't have done. David knew he was out drumming up business in front of the gate. The thing that David also knew, and I think this is the key to understanding David's reaction, was that Absalom was standing there in place of him. Absalom was in the position he was in usurping authority, putting himself in this dangerous position because of the sins of David. He did not want his son to die because of his sin. See, if he died, if he was killed in battle, he wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the sin of David. Now, I'm going to let you draw the parallels here. But think about Jesus Christ. Do we really consider the fact that he stood there in place of us? I mean, you know, we talk about it. Yeah, we talk about it. We see it. But when you look at David and his reactions during this whole thing, you can see how deeply ingrained it was in his heart that boy out there, whether he's my son or somebody else's, he's there because of my sin. He understood that. And he did not want the death of Abraham, or of Abraham, oh boy, is that one out there? Absalom, to be on his hands. All right. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel. And the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Now, we have to understand the woods of Ephraim were not in the tribe of Ephraim. We're on the wrong side of the Jordan River. There was a long band of forest, and these were terebinth and oak trees that stretched along the Jordan River on the east side for some distance. And it was, and they didn't fight battles in woods those days. So, and it said that the armies of Absalom were in the plains. So it's probably a case that the two armies clashed in the plains, and the armies of David so quickly overcame the army of Absalom that they ran into the woods. Now this is, we don't know positively, but this would make more sense in the way that they fought battles in those days. Now the problem was, once they got into these woods, were not woods like we have around here. These were woods that were full of potholes. I mean, and I'm talking big pits. You know, that whole country around there is full of caves and pits and all kinds of things. Well, in this forest were these big pits, and you couldn't even see them. I mean, they would be covered with leaves and branches, you know, and you're fighting and you're trying to get away from somebody and you're not paying attention. Next thing you know, you're down into one of those. Also, if they had long hair, they get caught in the branches. This was very, very thick forestry type things. And so they were running away, and it says here, the woods actually killed more than the sword. And they also had wild animals. The wild animals would run from the clatter of huge armies out there, you know, but if you're just running through the forest trying to get away from somebody, you're liable to be picked up by one of those bears that they had in those days, or the lions, you know, that David slew, and you had other animals in there. So it was a dangerous place in these woods. 20,000 soldiers died the first day. One day of battle, 20,000. And I think about today, with all of our modern arms and everything that we have a battle and 5 people die and it makes the headlines. Really, I mean, think about it. We should be killing thousands and thousands and thousands with all of our weapons. They would kill thousands with a sword. Kind of puts things in perspective, I think. All right. Let's get down through some of this. All right. Verse 18, or verse 9, I'm sorry. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under a thick bough of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between the heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. Now this is almost comical. I mean, this would be something you'd see on Saturday morning comics, you know, or something, you know. He's riding along, and his hair is flowing out behind him, and he's got this mule, and I don't know how you get a mule to do anything you want him to do, but he had this thing going, and he's probably on a run with his mule, and either his hair, which is, most scholars feel it was his hair, came out behind him and caught in this terebinth tree. And they didn't have saddles and stuff like we have today. So as soon as his hair caught in that, he yanked him backwards and the mule took off. And here he is flopping in the breeze, hanging out there, trying to get a hold of something to get his hair down and to get up in the tree or down from the tree. You can kind of picture this. He's in his fancy royal robes because that's the way he wanted everybody to know who he was. And there he is. An unknown soldier. Here comes an unknown soldier. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? And why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded, and you, Abishi and Iti, saying, beware, lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I would have dealt falsely against my own life. Nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. So here's this unknown soldier. He may have been one that was chasing Absalom, probably so. And Absalom's hanging in this tree. And this soldier, and probably the ones that were with him, they just went away. They weren't going to touch Absalom. Why? That was the command of David. So he came back and told Abner. A tree over there. He probably supposed that Abner would go with some men and take him down, arrest him, and take him to David. What he didn't know was Abner had no intentions of in any way Absalom. But he says to this man, he said, if you would have killed him, I would have given you 10 shekels and a belt. And we look at that and we say, well, what is that? Well, a shekel in those days was about 0.5 ounces of silver. And in today's, well, when I looked at this up, the price of silver was $40 an ounce. That would be about $600. So we look at it today and say, $600. Well, that's really good. I can buy some bubble gum or something with it today, But in those days, that money, as far as worth, worth is different than the value of the money as far as monetary value. The worth of the money is how much you can buy with it. What is it worth? I know when I was a kid, 39 cents was what it cost for a pound of hamburger or a half a gallon of milk or 10 pounds of potatoes and a loaf of bread. Any of those you could get for 39 cents. I remember that. It's just one of those things stuck in my... So when I go to the store and I see $2 for a loaf of bread and I say, it should be 39 cents! But money went further in those days. And in the day we're talking about here, that would have equaled $12,000 to $15,000 in worth. Plus, he would have been given a belt. His belt was a military sash. And on it, and when you wore these, they were given for various reasons. If you were promoted to an officer, you got a sash that says you're now the officer. They didn't have uniforms like we have with stripes and hats and all the fancy stuff. But that sash said this is the general, this is the whatever was on the sash. And it was also given to heroes. And so this meant you were, like we do today, they get the the Congressional Medal of Honor or some other Silver Star or something for bravery. Well, that's what that sash would equate to. So this guy would instantly become probably a officer and be held in high esteem because of his, you know, thing. Plus, he'd get all this money. Notice his response. Though I were to receive 1,000 100 times more. I wouldn't lay a hand on him. I wouldn't touch him. Why? Because David said not to. You see, this man held David in such high regard. Now you say, yeah, well, he was afraid David would kill him. Well, let's see, if I had $12,000 to $15,000 in those days, and I had a sash, you know, I could probably go off someplace, some other country, and live like a king. I didn't have to stay around David, I could go someplace else. And would David actually hold him, who was just a soldier, responsible? Don't know. But the point is that he held the word of David higher than the wealth that he would have attained. And of course, he uses 100 times more, you know, and 10,000 and all of that. But what he's saying is, you couldn't offer me enough to go against my king. There's a lesson there. I'll let you guys, you can figure that one out. We got to move on. All right. He mentioned something here interesting. He said that the king, nothing is hidden from the king. He will find everything out. It isn't, you know, that's true. When we do something wrong, you know, we can hide it, we can think we're hiding it, but we cannot hide it from the king. He's going to find out. King of kings, Lord of lords, he knows everything. We think we can hide things sometimes. And it may not be things we're doing wrong, maybe it's just things we didn't do that we should have done. Both sides. But he knows. And he went on to say that, you know, Joab, that if I had done that, and the king found out, no matter how much you paid me, and how many sashes you gave me, you would be the one who would take my life, because you're my commander. And you follow orders. So there was some very good reasoning behind this man. All right. Verse 14. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel. For Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his own tent. Now Absalom, in his lifetime, had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument. Now, Joab was afraid the opportunity would slip away. Perhaps Absalom would take out his sword and cut off his hair, and down he'd fall, and then he would never be able to find him. So this was his opportunity to take out Absalom. Why was Joab going to take out Absalom when David said not to? It's because Joab was a commander. Joab was a strategist. Joab knew what it meant to spare the king or the leader of an army. And he knew that unless Absalom was killed, it would bring nothing but trouble to the kingdom as long as he was there. He would once again have followers behind him, even if he didn't. If they were thrown in prison, you'd have people causing trouble constantly who were on Absalom's side. Right? And so Joab, being the commander that he was, now people criticize him. They say, well, he had a personal revenge or whatever. whatever his drive was, you have to admit he knew what he was doing. And so he immediately went out, took 3 spears and put them through Absalom. Now, heart doesn't mean that he went through the physical pumping heart in here. Heart is the middle of the body. So he put him through and evidently missed the heart. And Absalom is still alive up there. Now he's flopping around with 3 spears sticking through him, and there he is. And the armor bearers of Joab came over, 10 of them. Why he needed 10 armor bearers, I don't know. But it was the job of the armor bearer. You know, we think about knights and all of that, and they went in front of the knight with their shield, you know, and carried their swords. Well, they didn't really kind of do that. They took care of spare swords. They did bring those for whoever their master was. They took care of the equipment and all. But also it was their job in battle that when their master would strike somebody and they'd go and fall on the ground or whatever or be injured, it was their job to kill them. They came along and finished up what the master was doing. You remember Jonathan, when he went up to the camp of the Philistines, where they had that outpost. Remember, he climbed up the steep cliff, him and his armor bearer, and he was knocking them down, and his armor bearer would kill him. He only had 1 sword, you remember? So until the armor bearer killed enough somebody to get a sword, he didn't even have a sword. So Jonathan would down with the sword, and the armor bearer would come along and kill him. Probably had a knife or whatever, and he was just whacking him up, and Jonathan knocking him down, and him whacking him up. Well, that was their job. That's what they did. They were, you could say they were killers. That was their job. And so 10 of them landed on Absalom. It's trouble when you get old. I can say Absalom 15 times, and the 16th time I can't remember what it was. I said the other 15. All right. So they took him then, and well, first of all, Joab sounded the trumpet. Now, it didn't mean he sounded it, but he had his trumpeters sound the trumpet. And just like the cavalry, you know, back in the old Western days, they received their commands when they were on horseback by the bugler. The bugler would bugle a tune, and that told them, get off your horses and get down on, you know, and ready to shoot, or run, or turn, or whatever. It was by the sound of the bugle. Same thing in those days. It was by the sound of the trumpet or the shofar. And he would sound the shofar in a certain rhythm or song or pitch, and it told them what they were supposed to do. And when he sounded this one, it said, battle's over. It's kind of like they're fighting away and they hear, oh, okay, we're done. See you later, have a good day. That was the end of the battle for the day. Well, in this case, it sounded the end of the battle. And so all the armies, the men of Absalom, went back to their tents. You know, I mean, you can picture this. They've been trying to kill each other, and all of a sudden the trumpet sounds. They just turn their backs and walk off, and the battle's over. Danger's over, even though this guy has just been trying to cut me to pieces. But that was the mindset of battles in those days. So he sounded the trumpet. Everybody went back to their tents, and they went out and they found a pit. One of these pits I was talking about. They threw the body of Absalom in it, and they just heaped it full of rocks, stones. And that's where they left him. Now, it says here that Absalom had no children, so he built this pillar or monument to himself, and he named it after himself. If you look on the back page, this one here, this is just outside Jerusalem, and I remember seeing it. We didn't go to look at it, but I do remember seeing it down by the valley of Kidron. I saw that thing, and I wasn't sure what it was. It's called the Tomb of Absalom. Well, we know that Absalom could not have been buried there because he's in that woods over there in that pit with the rocks on top of him. But quite possibly, the pillar he built was in fact a tomb. This was hewn out of solid rock. I went out and saw a little video where they were showing it, and you can actually see the marks on the walls of this solid rock, you know, where they had cut it out. And this thing was actually cut out of solid rock, and you see that beautiful thing. You know, maybe you don't think it's beautiful, but it's considered one of the most beautiful tombs. Absalom had that built for himself, and it was probably a tomb that he built for himself, and it was no doubt where he intended on being buried. And there's another tomb behind it where possibly his family, if he had a family after that, would be buried. So that was his intent. And he was no doubt, again, his idea of lavishness was thinking about the kings of Egypt, the pharaohs and their tombs and how they did things. So that may have also influenced him in what he was doing here. All right. Verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. All right, so it seems that Ahimaaz did not return to Jerusalem after bringing the message from Jerusalem about about what was going to happen. So he stayed with David, and he went with Joab to be a messenger. Now, what they would do, we mentioned it earlier, is they would take these messengers, these runners, and anytime Joab had to tell the king something, he would tell it to a runner. The runner would run to Joab or to David, and then David would send back the same runner with news of what he wanted to happen. You know, their cell towers were terrible in those days. Text didn't even get through. But these runners, they would run, and they had several runners. So here is Joab, and he has under his command Ahimaaz, and this Cushite. Now the Cushite was Ethiopian. He was a descendant from Ham, from the Cush, the land of Cush, which was today Ethiopia or northern Africa. And these were the guys that they didn't fight, they just ran. That's all their job was to run. And evidently, this Hamas must have been one of those guys, you know, one of these fitness guys who just likes to get up and run for no reason. Now, I used to do that. I used to run 17 miles in a day when I was in college, but I had a reason. I had a meet coming up I had to run in, you know, cross country or half mile or whatever I was running that day. So I was getting ready for that. But these guys just ran, and he evidently just loved to run, one of those guys. But he had evidently made the trip several times to David over this period of time. So he goes to Joab and he says, "Let me run, let me take the message. I want to go, I want to take the message." And Joab said, "No, you're not going today. You're going to go another day and take a message." Now, not the same message. We read that, it's easy to say, well, why would you want to take the news the battle was over tomorrow? It's, you know, not the same news. You take the message tomorrow, that's the message for tomorrow. And I'm going to send the Cushite today with a message for today. And he said the reason is because David's son is dead. You say, what does that got to do with anything? Well, you remember, this is Joab. He's been with David a while. And you remember when Saul was killed and Jonathan was killed in the battle? You remember what happened to the messenger who brought that news to David? He took off his head. Yeah. He had him slain right there because he brought the message. And so no doubt Joab was saying or thinking, you know, you're a very important spy. You've been with us a while. Your dad is the high priest, and I don't want to put you in that position of David suddenly taking your head off because you're bringing news that his son has been killed. Okay? So, he sends Cushite. Cushite takes off running with the message. Now notice, the problem here was he didn't have the right message. Ahimaaz did not have the right message. He may have had the message for the day before, but he didn't have the message for that day. And we have people today running around with messages to try to tell people what they need to do and how they need to do it, but it's yesterday's message. It's not today's message. And they don't change. They don't understand, that things today are not as they were yesterday. The Old Testament is our schoolmaster. It no longer brings anything. You can offer calves on the altar from now every day for the rest of your life, and it's not going to do you one bit of good. Except you'll have to eat a lot of meat, and you'll probably end up getting cancer. But people want to live in the past, and they want to think about things in the past. We need to think this today. What is today's message? So the Cushite takes off running, and he's probably been gone for some time, and finally he comes to Joab, and he said, Joab, come on, please, let me run. I want to run. He said, what do you want to run for? You don't even have the message. Oh, just let me run after the Cushite. He said, okay, run. You have to run. And so he took off running, but he took a shortcut. He went a different way. And he ended up in front of the Cushite. So now here's Ahimaaz, and he's running, and the Cushite's behind him. Verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates. That's in the middle of the gate. Between the gate posts. And the watchman went up to the roof, over the gate, to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, is he alone? He said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. And he came, and he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, there is another man running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. So the watchman said, I think the running of the first man is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. I'm going to die trying to say all these words. And the king said, he is a good man and comes with good news. So here you have Ahimaaz. He's running in front of the Cushite, and he evidently made the trip enough times and had such a different, unique running style that the watchman on the wall said, I think that's who that is. It looks like his running. Reminds me of the story years later when Jezebel and Jehud, when they saw Jehud coming in the chariot, and they said, that's Jehud running in that chariot. They could see, man, that chariot was being whipped all over the place. He was doing slideys through the corners. Yeah, whatever he was doing. But anyway, here's this runner running to David. Verse 28. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, all is well. Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. It sounds like he practiced this the whole way. Here's the news. The battle is over. You won. Verse 29. The king said, is the young man Absalom safe? Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great turmoil, but I did not know what it was about. And the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside and stood still. The problem was he didn't have the message for today. Now, this is my Allen thing here. But I think David already knew that he was going to gain the victory. God had already told him and anointed him to be king. He already knew that he was going to remain king. He understood this was a period in which he was being punished for his sin. So the question was not, did we win? The question was, how is Absalom? And we sometimes come with the wrong message because we don't understand the right question. We want to tell people sometimes how they ought to live instead of understanding that before they can live, they have to be new creatures. We get the horse before, or the cart before the horse.
That'd be cool.
We want people to live like Christians before they actually become Christians. Remember we talked last week about what does it mean to be a servant? When you're a servant, you will live the way you're supposed to live. But we want people to live the way they're supposed to before they ever become servants.
That'd be cool.
So our message should be for today, I think, what does it mean to be a servant? Give your life over to Him and be a servant. And you know what? The rest of it will take care of itself.
Yes.
Because that's when the Holy Spirit comes in and lead and guides. We have this mistake that says, well, when we repent of our sins and we come to the Lord, the Holy Spirit's going to lead and guide us. Holy Spirit's going to lead and guide you in some ways. He's going to convict you when you're doing something wrong, and you know there's some of that. But you have to understand how to listen to Him and how to respond to that. That only comes when you're a servant. Anyway, gotta move on. All right. Now the message was good news. David was right. He had good news. It just wasn't all the news. The only thing that he knew was that there was something of importance that had happened, but he didn't know what it was. All right, verse 31. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose up against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all who rise up against you to do harm, be like that young man." Dangerous way to answer. But he was a Cushite. That meant he was not an Israelite. He may have been a proselyte, whatever. But he was not one of the 10 tribes. He was not somebody that should understand how to treat David, you know. And that's why Joab wanted to send him. He had this advantage of not being educated maybe in the ways that you should do things. And so he just answered, well, I hope all the rest of them that rise up against you end up just like he did. Not a really good way to answer it. Verse 33. Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son." Is that the way that we feel about the death of Jesus? Do we say, "Oh, that I had been the one on that cross"? You ever thought about how we feel? How do we look at the cross? Sometimes, you know, we see so much about the cross that it just becomes a story. It just becomes, yeah, we understand the importance, but it's more like it's just a story. When we had Jesus of Nazareth a few years ago, maybe, I don't know if any of you saw that, but it was an outdoor in Puyallup up here, went for years. Well, I guess about 20 years. I was in that for 15, and one of the guys who started it, trained the horses and all that. But you know, after a while, you see that crucifixion scene, and you see the blood flying out. We had, of course, blood going everywhere. People would scream, people would holler, throw rocks at the soldiers. You know, I mean, it was that gripping And then you see him up on the hill being crucified, and the cross dropping in, and all of that. And you see that night after night after night, and it became, after a while, like, okay, now, did we spray that right? Was that spray good? You know, was that one good? Did this happen? What happened there? What did we do wrong here? And we're so wrapped up in the technologies and the things we were doing that after a while, that cross began to lose its effect. I noticed it in myself. Others mentioned it too. You know, that, man, you know, it's really hard to visualize the cross and put me in that position anymore. I see it so often. And I think if we're not careful, we lose the feeling for the cross. David, oh, that it had been me. I wish I had been the one on that cross. I deserve to be there. I wish it was me and not you. It's hard to explain that. It's hard, but that feeling, is that the feeling that we have lost? You know, when somebody comes to the Lord for the first time, especially it seems that they've really been what we call bad sinners, you know, whatever. But they come down there and they're so appreciative of the cross because it's not them that was hanging there. But should we sometimes look at it from the other way and say, I wish it was me instead of you? Well, that's it for tonight. Anybody have questions? I did it. I don't believe I actually did this. You notice I'm getting better.